Hello and welcome. In this tutorial, we will cover the radar calculation and the factors that contribute to it, the various radar components, and complete with a demonstration of what you can see at different ranges for all of the search radars. Radar within Nebulous Fleet Command is the primary means of locating and detecting enemy ships within the battlefield, not only for yourself, but also for your teammates. Ships use their radar panels to continually search, whilst active, for enemy ships that wander into their radar range. The radar panels on a ship, shown below in the red boxes on a Corvette, provide the coverage for the radar within the ship to do its search function. Panels can be destroyed and therefore remove radar coverage from that area of a ship. And as we go through later on, just because a ship loses its radar panels doesn't mean it always loses vision. So before we get into the tutorial, it's important to note that I'm not a radar professional. Apart from speaking with a developer, watching some online lectures, and doing some background research, I've been able to pull together all the different terms into something that is more simplified to present as opposed to taking everyone through a university lecture. Also note that this game may take liberties with the radar calculation for balance and playability. So let's go through the radar calculation and how it's used within the game. So the radar calculation used by Nebulous Fleet Command is based on real-life radar principles, and the formula used or shown on the title page just before to simulate the detection and the identification of ships within the battle space. Multiple factors contribute to whether a ship can be seen or unseen, and this tutorial is meant to provide an overview of these as opposed to enabling you to directly calculate where everything will be at different ranges. In the bottom right hand corner of the screen is a simplified diagram of how radars work and function, and we'll use those as we step through each of the factors that contribute to the radar calculation to show where each of the factors fall within the radar calculation. So let's have a look at the first component of the radar calculation, being radiated power. And this is the power output from the transmitter in an isotropic direction. Now, isotropic means in all directions equally, so think of it as an expanding sphere from the point of origin being the transmitter. If a transmitter has a low radiated power, it's not going to go as far as something that has a high radiated power, and that's shown on the screen with the power represented as the blue circles around the frigate hull. So if a radar has a lower radiated power, it's not going to go as far. If it has the high radiated power, expanding in all directions equally, it's going to be able to go a lot further. So let's have a look at the next factor, being gain. Antennas by their nature and use are generally directional. And so gain represents how focused or directionalized that radiated power is. This is measured in decibels, being dB. And so the decibels reference to how many times the gain increases with respect to 1, and 1 being the isotropic nature. So the gain will never be 1 and it will always be at least 3. So the higher the gain, the more focused an antenna is going to be. And gain increases on the logarithmic scale. So as a rule of thumb, the higher the gain, the more focused and powerful a transmission will be, with the lower the gain being more dispersed. And we can visualize this in game using the interruption jammer, the floodlight, and the spotlight components. Whilst the interruption jammer is a communications module, it is actually the only component within the game to provide a 360-degree coverage, and this visualizes for us the isotropic nature of the component radiating its communications in all directions. If we look at the floodlight, it has a wide beam, and the wide beam within the floodlight has a lower gain than that of the spotlight, and the spotlight is fairly focused and therefore has a higher number. So when we multiply the radiated power by the gain, we get transmitted power, or the transmitted signal, which is what we will send off into space with radio waves to determine whether we can see an object or not. It's important to note that the distance, both as we transmit the signal and as it returns back to us, will degrade over time, and this will degrade exponentially over the distance. So if an object is further away, then we expect both the transmitted signal and the received signal to degrade more than if something was closer. For us to be able to detect objects need to bounce or reflect transmitted radio waves back to us. And how they do this is in the form of the radar cross-section of the object. How detectable an object is based on how large the object is. A small object will not be able to bounce as much power back as, say, something as a battleship. The strength of the transmitted power, if the power is already weak enough by the time it reaches the target, it's not going to be strong enough to be able to transmit back across the void, back to our original ship. So we need enough power not only to hit the target, but also for it to make it back. and then the angle of the radio waves reflecting back to the transmitting ship. Now, the angle that the radio waves hit are important as they will determine how much or how little is reflected back to the transmitting ship. So for example, a flat panel is going to make it a lot easier to get those radio waves bouncing back as opposed to something that is angled. And you can consider this if you, for example, if you were throwing a ball or something. When you throw a ball against a flat surface, it's going to come back a lot easier than if you throw it at something that is, say, angled, where it's going to bounce off and then you're going to have to go get that ball. Now, this is where we get the radar signatures of the ships come into play. Note that when you're in the fleet editor, signatures under the hull heading, the radar signature there measured in meters squared is actually the maximum radar cross-section of that ship. So it's going to be the radar signature at your worst possible angle. And for a lot of ships, that's being directly side on. And when you're in game and you look at turning off your communications or your radars, those modifiers will show again for your maximum possible radar cross-section, again being at your worst angles. So as a general rule of thumb, if you have a flatter surface facing a transmitter, you're going to have a higher radar cross-section, and if you have more angled surfaces facing a transmitter, you're generally going to have a lower radar cross-section. Now, we can actually visualize this for each of the hulls, and I'd just like to thank AlexBay218 from the Discord, who has done not only a great job data mining all the various hulls, but he's actually put them into a 3D chart. And we can see that on screen here, beginning with the Sprinter. The darker parts, you'll be able to visualize the lower radar cross sections, and at the more red parts, that's where you're going to have your maximum radar cross. And so you can see as we move around, that the radar cross section will be shown to us. Here we can see the maximum radar signature is 2,890 meters squared, and if we come up to this top part here, we can see that it's 2,890. So for the Sprinter, your top and your bottom will be the worst, as will be your front and back. However, your sides are generally pretty good at around 1,700 meters, and I think if we come somewhere in about here, we'll be able to find the minimum radar signature being 1,092. I think somewhere maybe in here. For the Frigate, the reins, there are a lot more red locations because there are more flat panels on the side, the front, the top and the bottom, and the rear with the engines. However, when you start to get it from a corner or from an angle, as it is discussed in the tutorial, you're going to have a lot smaller radar cross section of 1,300 meters as opposed to 3,700. The Keystone again has its points being the top and bottom, and the back and front being its major points, as opposed to the smaller ones. However, there are a lot more flat panels, so it isn't degrading as much in terms of the radar cross section, and still fairly high. For the light cruiser, your worst positions are at the top and at the back and the bottom. However, from the sides and from the sort of the corner 3D angles is actually not too bad. You can get it down to about 4,300 from this sort of side front on angle here. The Axford, whilst its top is quite bad, its rear is quite bad, as is the sides and the front. It's actually quite good underneath, only at 5,000 meters, 1/3 of its maximum, and from any of the other oblique angles in between. And finally with the Solomon, again the top sides, back and front being the worst locations. However, even at its smallest, it's still about the same size of a light cruiser at its worst. And so I'll put all the links to the wiki down below so that you can have a look at these 3D charts in your own time. So now that our transmitted power or signal has hit an object and is being reflected back, we have the returning power moving back across the void. And again, this will degrade over distance exponentially and will always be less than the transmitted power, as it cannot increase after it hits its target. So when the returning power reaches the transmitting ship, then the antenna aperture of that ship is going to be able to collect all that power on the surface of that antenna. And so antenna aperture is the surface area of the antenna receiver, and the larger aperture size means it can collect more power at that point in time. and this is the final collected power value, being a terminology that I'm adding in here, and it's nothing from radar or from the developer, and this is what is going to be compared to determine whether or not something is seen or not. So to determine if something is seen or unseen, that final collected power value needs to be measured not only against the background noise of the battlefield, but also the radar's sensitivity. So this final collected power value must exceed both in order for a track to be seen. And this is measured in decibel milliwatts, or dBMs, within your component card. So noise is the background and the unwanted sounds that are registered during transmission and receiving. So think of this as the background noises around you, such as the sounds of cars on the street, or, if you've got your headphones on, the noise within those headphones. When the final collected power value exceeds the noise, then a signal can be heard. And so I've represented this on this mock-up graph below, with the blue line being the final power value, then the brown line being the noise floor. When the power collected exceeds that, then it can be heard. So the radar's sensitivity determines what the lowest possible power is for the radar receiver to detect a target. So the lower decibel milliwatts of the radar's sensitivity, the better, and this can be modified later on with other components. So when that final collected power value exceeds the radar's sensitivity, a signal can be seen. And I've represented this as the yellow line below. So as the transmitted power exceeds the noise floor, it then can be heard. However, if the radar sensitivity is not low enough, it'll be unable to be seen. Once that power value crosses the radar sensitivity, then a track can be seen. So if the front line had a lower radar sensitivity, and that yellow line was able to drop and touch that first blue triangle peak, then we would have seen a track at that point, as well as the additional spike and then continual growth of that power. So note that the power may change or spike, which will also enable it to move above the radar sensitivity, so such as moving closer to the target, or the radar cross section, or from the roll of a ship changing, enabling that radar to have enough power to therefore to see the track. So ultimately, for the best results, you want to have higher power, higher gain, a larger aperture size, a lower radar sensitivity, as well as being closer to your object. So as you get closer to the object, more power is going to be bounced back, and if there's a larger object, more power will be bounced back towards your radar's aperture. So let's have a look to see what happens when you finally cross the radar's sensitivity and the noise thresholds, and you can detect a track on the screen. So when your radar is able to finally see something, Nebulous Fleet Command will represent that as a track. Tracks have a number of information tied to them. Tracks will all have a positional and velocity error as a result of the radar identifying where it is, but not being 100% sure, and each radar will show its own positional and velocity error on its component cards. The positional and velocity errors have been represented within the game by the red dot that dances around the tracks that you'll see on your screen. Tracks also contain other information regarding the ship stored within them, and you'll be able to identify those over time through the intelligence mechanic of the game, which you can see in tutorial number 12 for more information. Now your fleet will also maintain a sensor network. So with multiple ships working in tandem, tracks will be able to be shared across the communications network between the ships, not only of your ships, but also of allied fleets. So assuming that your ship's able to transmit what it can see, and is able to receive information from other ships through its communications antenna, then you'll be able to be part of the sensor network. The best track or the track with the highest accuracy in the network will always be used by a ship firing upon a track that is not locked. So for example, if you have two ships, one has a spyglass and one has a frontline radar, and both detect something and an object is at 5 kilometers, so they both can see it, the frontline's track would be used when firing upon it, as the frontline has better positional and velocity errors than the spyglass. As each radar provides its updates to the network and its fellow ships, changes may occur over time as to which ship will be contributing the best or highest accuracy to the network when you use it to fire upon something. So just because you're using something at this point in time, later on something else may be provided, as it may have a better modifiers providing a better track. This is not something you'll really see within the game, and is largely conducted in the back end. Just know that the tracks that you are firing on will always be the best tracks within the sensor network, and will not simply be the worst ones because that ship is roughly there. So let's go through each of the components within the game. So first it's important to go through the types of radar. So there are two main types of radar and a subtype: search, lock, and fire control radars. The search radars give you the ability to actually search or see various other ships within the game. The frontline and the spyglass are dedicated search radars. They can do no other function other than simply look for and report that they have found something. The parallax is a hybrid of both the search and the lock radar types. It can not only find its own targets, but it can lock those targets as well, providing increased utility as a multifunction radar. And then we come to the locking radars. So the lock radars, being the bullseye and the fire control radars, need to be queued up or have the search radars present a track to them before they can lock them. The bullseye will be able to provide highly accurate information to the sensor network, so all ships firing on that will be able to have a very accurate firing solution. The bullseye operates a little bit differently to the search radars in games, even though it shares some of the statistics that feed into the radar calculation. For the purpose of this tutorial, I'm going to leave it out in terms of explaining it any further, other than the fact that it provides a highly accurate lock once it is presented a track by a search radar, and is able to maintain that lock for a long period of time out to its maximum range. Now, fire control radars can also provide locks, particularly on small targets. However, again, because they are point defense, you'll be unable to manually provide a lock onto an enemy ship, and each of these components will simply track and lock onto missiles within their range, being anywhere between 1700 and 4000 meters. It's important to note too how the game also uses these different types of radars. So for a search radar, every second it'll perform an acquisition sweep where it'll either be able to look for or lose a track, and then there'll also be an update every quarter or second, and this is where you'll see the red dot for the positional and velocity errors jump around the track once every quarter second. For the locks update every frame once they've been locked on, which is why they'll be able to maintain their lock a little bit better. And the fire control radars will need the sensor guidance just as much as the bullseye. However, the bullseye is slightly different, is once that track is gone, you can turn off your radar, your search radar, and still maintain that lock until it is broken via other means. So let's go through a few other statistics. Again, using the frontline radar component, range is hard capped and you cannot detect anything past that. So for the frontline radar, you'll never see anything further than 8,000 kilometers, no matter how much you buff that radar component, but with other modifiers, that's as far as it'll see. Likewise with the spyglass radar, which has the longest radar range in the game at 11 kilometers. Can the ship perform a lock or not? So can the ship provide the lock that a bullseye radar does, or in this case the parallax? Can it sweep? And this is related to what is a burn through sweep. So when a burn through sweep is activated through a radar that is able to do so, the radiated power will be multiplied by the factor displayed on the radar's component card, and this will boost the power and multiplied by the gain to rapidly increase the transmitted power that is launched across the void searching for objects. Again, as it bounces off the ship, the power that is returned is therefore also going to be increased, giving you a better chance to cut through the background noise and to find any objects that are out there that you may not normally see. This does come at a chance that you'll damage your radar, and you can see this on the component card at a 20% chance for a frontline radar. So let's have a look at the RS-35 frontline. This is your default radar and it'll be mostly used by most people most of the time. It is the cheapest in both points and power. However, it does have the weakest stats by far for all radar calculations. It also cannot lock, however it can sweep. So there's nothing wrong with using the frontline. You just need to realize that you're going to have to get fairly close to some things before you see it. However, you're probably going to be able to see most of the large stuff. The spyglass, this is basically your spotting radar. It has the longest range at 11.5 kilometers. It has the best radar calculation statistics, being its power, its gain, its aperture size, and its level of sensitivity. However, it cannot lock and it cannot sweep. The major downside of this radar is the fact that it has the worst positional and velocity errors of the other radars. So you don't really want to be using it to direct your fire in terms of long range, as that positional error is going to cause a lot of your shots to miss. However, if you are able to get close and you only have the spyglass radar left, then you'll eventually be able to hit something as you close that gap. You can also obviously mitigate this by using a spyglass to provide the search, and then using a bullseye radar to lock that target. So therefore removing the positional and velocity errors, or reducing the positional and removing the velocity errors that come associated with the bullseye radar. Ultimately, you want to equip this to your dedicated spotting ships, and therefore you want to protect them. It does have a massive power draw of 4,000 kilowatts, so when you are on your smaller ships, you really need to dedicate those ships to that task. However, that's also good, as you can sit these types of ships far enough away from the engagement, but still provide that vision. So the Parallax radar is basically the does-it-all radar. It is fairly expensive. Its point cost is 45 points, which is almost double that of a Spyglass, and its power is 3,600 kilowatts, just slightly less than the Spyglass again. However, it does allow you to provide both sweeps with a burn-through multiplier of 12, which is really good, and it does provide a locking function as well, so it can lock its own targets that it spots. So there is a bit of a quirk with the Parallax radar in terms of how its locking function works. It can only lock out to what its search radar would normally be able to see. So we see that the max range is 9.5 kilometers. So let's say that there is a target ship out at 9 kilometers that we can see because of the sensor network, and we want to put a lock onto it. If we could not detect that ship with our search function out at 9 kilometers and we actually needed it to be closer in at say 7, then this ship would be unable to provide that lock, as there'd be a 2.5 kilometer black hole between where it would be able to see and the actual object. And this is because it needs a higher sensor to noise ratio statistic, and you can see that on the component card under can lock. Basically what needs to occur is that the signal needs to be 3 times higher than the noise for it to be able to provide that lock, and we can see that with an additional line down on the previously shown diagrams. This isn't to scale, by the way. So why would you use this? With its large power, its apparent drawbacks, and its expensive point costs? Well, you could use this on a large independent ship that is designed to operate independently, particularly something that has projectile weapons that wants to get in nice and close. So the closer you get, the better this radar will operate, particularly with its lock. And this provides a little bit more early warning than you'd normally get with something like the Frontline, and therefore you don't also have to invest another 40 or 50 points for a bullseye. However, like all components within the game, this is situational and depends on your type of tactics, the opponent, and obviously your fleet build. So some of the supporting modifiers, we've got the track correlator. Note this is ship specific. It will reduce the positional and velocity errors of the equipped ship's radar by 20%. And so when we talk about the sensor network and contributing to the highest accuracy track within the sensor network, if you were to put this on a ship designed to get nice and close, and you weren't able to provide a lock, well then the sensor network is going to register so that a ship with a radar and a track correlator, the best or the highest accuracy track within the sensor network, and use that for other ships to shoot at. Not really worth it on the Spyglass, noting that as it has such a bad positional error, you're actually probably worth putting it maybe on something that is designed to get up close and personal, and therefore use it to increase the track in lieu of having a bullseye, or if that bullseye gets shot off. For 25 points, it is a little bit questionable whether it is worth the cost. However, leave it up to you. The adaptive radar receiver, again, is ship specific. It makes it easier to detect, so by increasing the sensitivity of the radar and therefore reducing the noise floor, and you can see this on the diagram that we've used to date. The dotted lines now represent the new values for the noise floor and the radar sensitivity. You can see the first peak of the blue line being that collected power, and we would actually receive a track at that first peak, and then earlier for the rest of the signal on that second peak and upwards climb. It does come with a negative positional and velocity error, so this can be offset with the track correlator, or you can equip this onto something that is not actually intended to use or become the highest accuracy. So you'd be able to equip this onto a frigate, for example, that has a spyglass and therefore increase the chance of seeing something out to that 11.5 kilometers without intending for it to be used as the track with the highest accuracy. So if we have a look at the other components, these are all ship-specific modifiers and something to determine whether you want to take them or not. The signature scrambler is something I would definitely suggest not taking. The identification difficulty is not really worth it, as shown in the radar tutorial, specifically with the fact that the sensitivity will be 10% worse. It's just not worth the trade-off, and it's not worth the points value. So the prowler drive is something that you could potentially use on spotters if you have no interest in it moving fast or turning quickly, and simply requiring it to stay hidden while providing vision. It'll be able to reduce the signature size of the ship, which is one of the factors whether a ship is seen or not seen. The radar drive, however, is sort of the opposite. It'll increase your radar signature size by 25%, and if you don't really care about that ship being seen or not, or you want it to be seen, maybe something like a battleship or a light cruiser or a heavy cruiser, but you definitely want to have that flank damage probability reduced and you want to increase your thrust in a straight line, then this is definitely something for you. There is a smaller version of both the radar and the prowler that you can take. Finally, the small reactor booster, you're going to increase your power plant efficiency by 10%, so you'll get 10% more power resource for that ship at the cost of a radar signature increase of 5%. This can be worth the trade-off, and this is situational, particularly for only 10 points, which is quite cheap. A 5% increase on things such as a Corvette or a Frigate isn't too bad, particularly if you are then compensating for that with the prowler drives or other components. So today we've talked all about how to find different ships at different ranges, and the demonstration has shown what we're likely to see at different ranges with different radars, but how do we avoid detection and how do we avoid being seen on our enemy's radar? So the first thing we can do is we can reduce our ship's angle to the transmitted power. So by using the heading and the roll orders, we'll be able to move, instead of from the front on, from a side on or an oblique position, therefore reducing the radar cross section. We can also further reduce our radar cross-section within the game by turning off our communications as well as our radar, and this will evenly reduce the radar cross-section signature size. An oldie but a goodie, we can always block with terrain. Radar can't go through any of the terrain within the game, so you're able to break a lock by moving behind terrain, or you're able to disappear from an enemy sensor network as long as nothing else can see you if you move behind terrain. And finally, you can overwhelm the search radars with radar jamming. Eventually, with enough radar jamming, you'll be able to remain invisible for a short period of time. And that'll be the focus of the next tutorial, being radar jamming. Right, that ends this tutorial. I hope this has cleared up a few things around radar, particularly with the demonstration. If you have any questions or comments, throw them down in the comment section below, and I'll try to get to as many of them as I can. And if I can't, well, I'll take them off and I'll see if I can get them answered for you. Right, take care and have a good day.